Imagine waking up with no house, no supermarket, no refrigerator, no farm. Your entire food supply depends on what you can find, catch, or collect. Today, you eat. Tomorrow, you have no idea. For thousands of years, this was normal human life. But then, something changed. Humans began staying in one place. They began planting seeds. They began waiting. And eventually, they became farmers. But here's the strange part. Farming didn't simply make human life easier. It created more work, more dependence on the weather, more risk, and in some places, even worse health and living conditions. So why did humans choose it? Why abandon a mobile life for fields, crops, storage, and months of waiting? The answer is far more complicated than simply because they needed food. Before farming, humans weren't simply wandering around randomly. They were highly adapted to their environment. They hunted animals, collected fruits and roots, gathered seeds, used fire, made tools, tracked seasons, and remembered where food could be found. Their lives were difficult, but they had one enormous advantage: mobility. If food disappeared from one area, they could move. If the weather changed, they could move. If animals migrated, they could follow them. Their home wasn't a single piece of land. Their home was the landscape itself. And these weren't mindless wanderers. Hunter-gatherers lived in small, tight-knit groups. They shared knowledge. They passed survival skills from one generation to the next. They understood the land in ways that modern humans can barely imagine. Which plants were safe to eat, which berries were poisonous, which animal tracks meant danger, which season brought which fruit. They carried entire libraries of knowledge inside their minds. But eventually, some human groups began spending more and more time in the same places. Why? Because certain locations had something valuable: reliable seasonal food, wild grains, fish, animals, water. And when humans returned to the same locations year after year, they started noticing patterns. Which plants grew where? When did they produce seeds? Which seeds were bigger? Which areas produced more food? And eventually, one observation changed everything. If a plant grows here every year and drops its seeds into the soil, what happens if humans deliberately place those seeds into the ground? Agriculture probably wasn't invented in a single moment. There wasn't one ancient person who suddenly looked at a seed and said, "I'm going to invent farming." It was a much slower process. Observation, experimentation, repetition. Humans collected plants. They noticed where seeds fell. They noticed which plants produced more useful seeds. And eventually, they began influencing the process. Think about what that required. It required patience. It required memory. It required the ability to connect cause and effect across weeks, sometimes months. A seed goes into the ground today. Nothing happens tomorrow. Nothing happens next week. But weeks later, a plant appears. That connection between action and delayed result was one of the most powerful ideas in human history. That was a massive change in human thinking. Before farming, the question was often, where can we find food? Now another question became possible. How can we make food grow here? And that sounds like a simple change. It wasn't. Because once humans started producing food, they started creating something they had never possessed on the same scale before: surplus. And surplus would change everything. But first, it came with a price. We often tell human history like this. Hunter-gatherers lived a primitive life. Then agriculture appeared. Then humans became civilized. But reality is more complicated. Early farming could be extremely demanding. Farmers had to clear land, prepare soil, plant seeds, protect crops, wait for rain, remove competing plants, harvest, process food, store it, and then do it again. A hunter might have a bad day, but a farmer could have a bad season. And that difference was enormous. If the harvest failed, the problem wasn't just today's dinner. It could threaten the entire community for months. There's another detail that many people don't consider. Studies of ancient skeletons show that early farmers were often shorter and showed more signs of nutritional stress than the hunter-gatherers who came before them. Why? Because hunter-gatherers ate a wide variety of foods: meat, fish, nuts, fruits, roots, but early farmers often depended heavily on one or two crops: wheat, barley, rice. And when those crops were all you had, your body paid the price. And then came another transformation. Hunters carried their food with them. Farmers began storing food, grain, seeds, dried crops, food that could survive beyond a single day. And surplus food created something revolutionary. Not everyone had to spend every waking hour finding food. Some people could make tools, others could build shelters, others could trade, others could specialize. Food production was beginning to support an entirely different kind of society. But this is where the story takes another turn. Surplus food didn't just help create civilization, it also created something civilization had never seen before on the same scale: control. Imagine a small farming settlement. At first, just a few families. Then more. More houses, more storage, more crops, more people. And suddenly, land matters, water matters, grain matters. The resources that once existed mainly as things to find were becoming things that could be stored, protected, exchanged, and controlled. And with storage came something new: inequality. Not every family had the same amount of grain. Not every family had the same access to water. Not every family had the same size of land. For the first time, wealth could be accumulated. And where wealth accumulates, power follows. And population began increasing. More people meant more workers. More workers meant more food production. More food, more people, more labor, more food. A cycle had begun. Eventually, some settlements became towns. Some towns became cities. And thousands of years later, states and civilizations emerged. But there was another hidden consequence. Because once humans built permanent homes, leaving was no longer so simple. A hunter-gatherer could move. A farmer had something to lose. A house, a field, stored grain, tools, animals, neighbors, and perhaps most importantly, a future tied to that location. Farming also changed human dependence. A community could become heavily dependent on a few crops. The consequences could spread across the entire population. If disease affected crops, food supplies could collapse. And when humans began living closer together, new forms of disease could spread more easily. Not just crop disease, human disease. Living in permanent settlements, near animals, created conditions for illnesses that hunter-gatherers had rarely faced. Infections, parasites, epidemics. The very thing that made farming successful, staying in one place, growing in number, also made humans more vulnerable. So why didn't they simply return to the old lifestyle? Because by then, the system had become too valuable to abandon. They had built something. They had accumulated resources. They had families. They had communities. They had a future. And that changed the human mind. Because the greatest revolution of farming wasn't what humans grew in the ground. It was what farming changed inside the human brain. Think about the difference. A hunter needs to think about today's food. A farmer has to think months ahead. Plant today, harvest later, store today, survive tomorrow, protect this year's crop for next season. Agriculture forced humans to become planners on a much larger scale. The future became something you could prepare for, something you could sacrifice for, something you could build toward. And that idea is enormous, because civilization itself depends on delayed rewards. You work today for something that may exist years later. You build a house for the future. You plant trees for people who may never know you. You raise children who will live in a world you won't completely see. And farming changed something else. It changed how humans understood ownership. A hunter-gatherer shared the landscape with the group. A farmer looked at a piece of land and thought, "This is mine. I cleared it, I planted it, I watered it." The concept of personal territory, of land that belongs to someone, became deeply embedded in human thinking, and from ownership came boundaries. From boundaries came disputes. From disputes came rules. From rules came laws. From laws came governments. All of it traces back to a farmer standing in a field, saying, "This belongs to me." Agriculture didn't invent all of these ideas, but it created an environment where long-term planning, ownership, and social structure became increasingly important. And that changed humanity. Once food could be produced and stored at scale, human society could become more complex. Some people farmed. Some made tools. Some traded. Some built. Some organized communities. Eventually, writing systems appeared in certain regions, not by accident. When you store grain, you need to count it. When you trade, you need to record it. When communities grow, You need rules that people can remember and reference. Writing didn't emerge from poetry or philosophy. It emerged from accounting, from managing surplus, from keeping track of who owned what. Governments developed, markets expanded, large construction projects became possible, cities emerged, and civilization grew. But underneath all of this was food. A city cannot survive without a food supply. An army cannot march without food. A government cannot support a large population without food. A civilization cannot grow beyond its agricultural base. And it all traces back to something incredibly small: a seed, one piece of soil, one season, and an idea. What if we can create tomorrow's food today? Imagine an ancient farmer standing in a field thousands of years ago. No machines, no weather forecast, no scientific explanation for genetics, no guarantee that the rain would come, just soil, seeds, and hope. He plants the seed, then waits. He doesn't know that thousands of years later, humans will live in enormous cities. He doesn't know that agriculture will support civilizations spanning continents. He doesn't know that his descendants will transform the planet. He doesn't know that the simple act of placing a seed into the ground will eventually lead to skyscrapers, governments, written language, and the world as we know it. He only knows one thing: if I work today, tomorrow might be different. That is the real story of the transition from hunter to farmer. It wasn't simply the story of humans learning how to grow plants. It was the story of humans learning to live for a future they couldn't see. The question changed. First, where will we find food today? Then, how much can we save for tomorrow? And eventually, what can we build for the generations after us? A tiny seed created a field. The field helped create a village. The village helped create cities. And cities helped create civilization. Every time you sit down to eat a meal, you didn't hunt or gather yourself. Every time you plan for next month, next year, or the next decade, you are living inside the world that farming built. A world that began with one ordinary human, placing a tiny seed into the soil and choosing to believe in tomorrow. Civilization may not have begun with a palace, a king, or a great invention. It may have begun with an ordinary human placing a tiny seed into the soil and choosing to believe in tomorrow.